Have you ever witnessed someone completely underestimate a true professional? Well, Ryan Mitchell did, and let's just say it didn't end well for him. But before we dive into more jaw-dropping stories like this, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications because tomorrow, at this exact time, we're bringing you another unbelievable tale you won't want to miss. Trust me, it's one for the books. See you in the comments. Taekwondo Black Belt kicks a royal guard. What happens next will shock you. Ryan Mitchell had always believed in his skills. At just 30 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades mastering Taekwondo, earning his third-degree black belt after a grueling 6-hour examination. Back home in Denver, his reputation as a fighter was well known. His dojang walls were covered in trophies, state championships, national competitions, and even a few international tournaments. He had trained with some of the best coaches in the country, sparred against high-level opponents, and never backed down from a challenge. But lately, something had been bothering him. Winning titles and collecting medals wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more. He wanted to prove that his skills weren't just for sport. In a controlled environment, with referees and padded mats, he knew exactly how to dominate his opponents. But what about in real life? What about against someone who wasn't playing by the same rules? That question had been on his mind for months. So when he found himself standing outside Buckingham Palace during a trip to London, watching the royal guards in their pristine uniforms, standing motionless under the afternoon sun, an idea formed in his mind. He had heard stories about these guards, how they were trained, how they never reacted, how they could stand there for hours without flinching. But Ryan wasn't convinced. To him, they looked rigid, restricted by their uniforms, and untested in real combat. One guard in particular caught his attention, Sergeant Daniel Carter. He stood tall, rifle in hand, eyes fixed straight ahead, the perfect picture of discipline. Ryan watched him closely, noting his stance, the way he held himself, the way he didn't react to anything around him. To the average tourist, this was impressive. But to Ryan, it was an opportunity. He smirked to himself. What would happen if someone really tested one of these guards? Could they actually fight? Or were they just ceremonial figures, trained only to march and look intimidating? His curiosity burned inside him, pushing him toward a reckless decision. As the crowd took pictures and admired the changing of the guard, Ryan took a step closer. His heart pounded with excitement, a familiar rush before a fight. He had faced countless opponents in the ring, but this would be different. This time, there were no rules, and he was about to find out if the Royal Guard was ready for a real challenge. Ryan took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes locked on Sergeant Carter. The buzz of tourists chatting, the clicks of cameras, and the distant hum of London traffic all faded into the background. His focus narrowed. He had spent his life analyzing opponents, reading their stance, spotting weaknesses, calculating angles. But Carter, he was unreadable, a stone pillar in a sea of movement. The crowd milled around, oblivious to what was about to happen. Families snapped photos, couples admired the grand architecture, and children pointed in fascination at the guards. None of them noticed the shift in Ryan's posture, the subtle adjustment in his balance, the slight bend in his knees. Years of training had ingrained these movements in him. Even as he played the role of an innocent tourist, his body was preparing for a fight. He took another step forward, just inches from the red velvet rope that separated the public from the guards. Most people instinctively stopped there, respecting the invisible boundary. Ryan didn't. He let his foot linger on the edge, testing the waters, watching for any sign that Carter had registered his presence. Nothing. The guard's face remained stoic, his hand steady on his rifle. Ryan smirked. Is this guy even paying attention? A few tourists noticed his unusual behavior. A middle-aged woman gave him a wary glance before pulling her husband's arm and whispering something. A young man holding a camera turned his lens toward Ryan, sensing that something was off. But Ryan didn't care. His attention was locked on Carter. He decided to push further. Nice uniform, he said, just loud enough for the guard to hear. No response. Bet it gets pretty hot standing here all day, huh? Still nothing. Ryan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I've always wondered, how much combat training do you guys actually get? Or is this all just for show? A small crowd had started forming now, people instinctively giving them space. The tension in the air was shifting. Even those who didn't understand what was happening could feel it. Ryan felt a surge of adrenaline. His heart rate picked up, his muscles tensed. He had trained his entire life for moments like this, testing limits, proving himself, pushing past the rules. And now, standing face to face with Sergeant Carter, he was about to do exactly that. Ryan's smirk deepened as he took another step forward, finally crossing the invisible boundary that every other tourist instinctively respected. The crowd stirred uneasily. A few people whispered, their eyes darting between him and the motionless guard. Someone had started recording, sensing that something was about to happen. Still, Sergeant Carter didn't move. His grip on his rifle remained firm, his expression unreadable. His posture was textbook military precision, shoulders squared, back straight, feet planted with unwavering discipline. Ryan tilted his head, sizing him up like he would any opponent in the ring. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Give me something." Nothing. The silence only fueled Ryan's resolve. He wasn't looking to hurt the guy, just to test him, see if there was any real training behind that stiff, ceremonial stance. It wasn't like he was throwing a full-force kick to the head, just a little pressure, a controlled strike, enough to see what this so-called elite guard was really made of. He adjusted his footing, shifting his weight onto his back leg. The movement was smooth, instinctive. His right foot lifted slightly, just enough to disguise his intent. Years of sparring had trained him to move without warning, to strike before an opponent could react. He wasn't expecting much. Maybe a flinch, a stumble, a slight shift in balance. Instead, the moment his kick connected with Carter's shin, Ryan felt something he hadn't anticipated. Resistance. It was like kicking a steel post. His foot rebounded off the guard's leg with an unexpected jolt, sending a sharp shockwave up his shin. His eyes widened. What the hell? He had broken thick wooden boards with less effort, sent trained fighters stumbling back with similar strikes. But Carter? He hadn't even moved. For the first time, Ryan felt something creeping into his mind, doubt. The crowd collectively held their breath. A little girl clutched her mother's hand, her eyes wide with confusion. A few tourists exchanged nervous glances, unsure if they had just witnessed an accident or something deliberate. Ryan barely had time to process his mistake before it happened. Sergeant Carter moved. It was subtle, just a shift in weight, a slight rotation of his foot. But in that split second, Ryan's balance was gone. Before he could react, before he could reset his stance, he felt a sharp, precise force against his leg. And suddenly his world turned upside down. Ryan barely had time to register what was happening. One moment he was standing firm, confident in his stance. The next, he felt the ground vanish beneath him. Sergeant Carter's counter was so fast, so precise, that Ryan's brain struggled to process it. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement, just a perfectly executed response that turned Ryan's own momentum against him. His foot was still withdrawing from the failed kick when Carter shifted. A simple pivot, effortless yet devastating. His right ankle hooked behind Ryan's extended leg, trapping it mid-motion. At the same time, Carter adjusted his center of gravity, applying just enough pressure to tip the scales in his favor. Ryan's balance shattered instantly. His instincts screamed at him to counter, to regain control, but it was already too late. His body was moving before his mind could catch up. Gravity took over. His left foot slipped. His knee buckled. His torso pitched forward as he reached out, desperate for something, anything to break his fall. Then, impact. His palms hit the gravel first, the rough surface scraping his skin. His shoulder followed, absorbing the force of the landing. Then his face. Tiny stones dug into his cheek as his breath left him in a stunned gasp. For the first time in years, Ryan Mitchell, the undefeated fighter, the black belt champion, the man who prided himself on control, had been completely overpowered. The crowd erupted, a collective gasp, followed by hushed whispers and the frantic clicking of phone cameras. Some people took a step back, unsure whether they had just witnessed an accident or something far more deliberate. Ryan groaned, blinking in shock. His body ached, but his pride took the real hit. He had spent his life perfecting his techniques, training for every possible scenario. And yet, in less than 2 seconds, he had been dismantled like an amateur. He pushed himself up, wincing. His eyes snapped to Sergeant Carter, expecting some sign of triumph, a smirk, a taunt, something. But the guard hadn't even moved. Carter stood exactly as he had before, eyes forward, face blank, as if nothing had happened. No acknowledgement, no reaction, no shift in posture. And in that moment, Ryan understood. This wasn't just training. Sergeant Carter wasn't just a ceremonial soldier. He was a professional. Ryan sat there, his hands pressing into the gravel, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind was racing, trying to catch up with what had just happened. He had fought against top-tier martial artists, trained under some of the best coaches, and yet, in a single fluid motion, Sergeant Carter had taken him down without so much as shifting his posture. A fresh wave of humiliation burned through him as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Phones were out, cameras rolling. He could already imagine the headlines. Taekwondo champion gets dropped by Royal Guard. His moment of proving himself had turned into a spectacle, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought these soldiers were just for show. A sharp voice cut through the commotion. "Sir, stand down!" Ryan barely registered it at first, still caught in the haze of disbelief. But then he felt it. Carter's presence above him, towering, unmoving, still holding his rifle exactly as he had before. The guard's voice had been low, almost quiet, but it carried the kind of authority that left no room for argument. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. Stand down, or else. Security was already moving in. Two uniformed officers approached from the side, their expressions unreadable. A palace official spoke into his radio, while another guard, stationed a few feet away, kept a watchful eye on the scene. Ryan forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, his pride shattered. He turned toward Carter, searching for something, acknowledgement, maybe even respect. But there was nothing. Carter wasn't gloating. He wasn't amused. He simply stood there, locked in his duty, as if Ryan had never existed. "Sir, you need to come with us," one of the officers said, gripping his arm. Ryan started to protest, but what was the point? He had already lost, not just the fight, but the entire moment. Carter had dismantled him without breaking a sweat, and then resumed his position as if it had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. As they led him away, Ryan glanced back one last time. The crowd had shifted focus, now watching Carter with new eyes, with respect, with awe. The guard hadn't just won. He had taught Ryan a lesson he'd never forget. And that was the moment Ryan finally understood. He had never been the one testing the guard. The guard had been testing him, and he had failed. What do you think was going through Ryan's mind in those final moments before he hit the ground? Was it shock, regret, or maybe, just maybe, the realization that he had made a terrible mistake? Let's talk about it in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone completely underestimate a true professional? Maybe a friend who thought they could outsmart a security guard, a coworker who challenged the wrong expert, or even a moment in your own life where reality hit harder than expected. And here's the big question. Do you think Ryan learned his lesson, or will his ego make him try something reckless again? Let us know what you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping real-life encounters like this one. We've got another incredible story dropping tomorrow at the same time, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation going. See you in the comments.